Hi everyone, my name is Aleksander, and I'd like to talk about the power of multi-step Vizing chains. All right, so the problem we'll be considering is that of edge colorings. So a K edge coloring is just a function from the set of edges into some color space of K colors. And we say the edge coloring is proper if for any two edges that share an endpoint, we ensure that they have different colors. And we might also have a partial edge coloring where some of the edges are uncolored, and then we will allow edges that share an endpoint to be uncolored. That's not going to destroy the properties of the coloring. So, for instance, here we have an edge coloring because neighboring edges receive different colors, but this is also a proper partial edge coloring if the black edges denote something that's not colored. And we denote the smallest k for which it's possible to construct a proper edge coloring by the chromatic index. And clearly this is at least the maximum degree delta, because edges, all edges around a vertex must receive different colors. And clearly we can also use at least 2 delta minus 1 colors by just any greedy procedure. But Vizing's celebrated theorem actually showed that the chromatic index is no more than delta plus 1. And even though probably all of you already know this proof, I'm gonna remind you of some of the details because it will be relevant for later on also. So the basic idea is we take some proper partial delta plus 1 edge coloring C, and we fix some uncolored edge. Let's call it UV. And now we want to show that we can also extend this coloring to color the edge UV, possibly by recoloring some of the already colored edges. And the basic idea is to construct what's called a Vizing chain on U or on the edge UV. So we start with the edge UV, and let's fix the endpoint U and consider the other endpoint V. Now, we know that there will be some color that is available at V, meaning that none of the edges adjacent to V has received this color yet, because V has degree at most delta, and we have at least delta plus 1 colors available. So if this color is also available at U, then we can certainly color this uncolored edge with the color A, and then we are done. So let's assume that this color is not available at U, meaning that there is some edge incident to U that received this color. Now we can go and ask at the other endpoint of this edge. Now you also have an available color. If this color is also available at U, then we could color this edge colored A with the new color B, and then color the original edge with the color A. So we also assume that this color B is not available at U. And we can continue this procedure for as many steps as we like. And we call this construction a fan on the edge UV, or simply on the vertex U, that is sort of the center of the fan. And it's clear once we have this fan that we can sort of move the uncolored edge around, whilst retaining that the coloring is a proper color, right? By sort of shifting the colors along the fan. That works by construction. But there are two cases where we might have to stop this fan construction. One of them we already discussed. If we at some point encounter a vertex that's also available at U, then we could simply shift the uncolored edge until this point and then color it with this color that would be available at both endpoints, and then we'd have a bigger proper edge coloring. Or we might stop also if the available color, let's call it S, was also available at some previous color I. Because in this case, if we tried to continue construction, we would just be looping around. So that gets us nowhere. But luckily we can stop here. And the idea is then, once we do that, to fix some T that's available at U, and then the S that was available at the original vertex, and then consider the bichromatic path that begins at the vertex WK. Now, this bichromatic path might go back and start to intersect and overlap the fan. Those cases can also be handled. I'm going to ignore them for now and simply say that, let's say that this bichromatic path ends somewhere in the distance, far away, that we haven't talked about. And then this bichromatic path would actually allow us to extend our coloring, because we could shift the uncolored edge all the way up onto K, and then we could sort of shift it along the bichromatic path, and in the end we'd get an available color that's available at both endpoints, and that would allow us to extend the coloring, right? It would look like this. All right. And an important detail is that we could also decide to move this uncolored edge onto the bichromatic path, right? We could decide to uncolor some edge along the bichromatic path, essentially shortening the bichromatic path, and then shift the shortened version of the path. And then we would have moved our problem from sitting over here to now sitting somewhere over here. Okay. Now, an important notion for today is going to be augmenting subgraphs. What is an augmenting subgraph? Well, basically, it's just if we have some edge color C, and we want to extend it to also color some uncolored edge. Well, then H is an augmenting subgraph for this uncolored edge if we can extend C by only changing the coloring on this subgraph H. And so, in some sense, what Vizing showed was that there exists an augmenting subgraph that has size at most delta plus n. But that's unfortunately also a lower bound on the size of the thing Vizing constructed. But we're going to call this subgraph a Vizing chain, and it consists of a fan and sort of a bichromatic path. All right. Now, a natural question to ask is, can we say more than this, right? So what if we try to impose stronger conditions on our coloring? Will there still exist an augmenting subgraph? For instance, we could require that the coloring for an edge UV actually depend on the endpoint, the degree of the endpoints, and not just delta plus 1, right? So we could say that it must receive a color from the range 1 up until 1 plus the maximum degree of the endpoints. Is it still possible to get a proper edge coloring? It turns out the answer is yes. Also, we could ask the question, does there exist smaller augmenting subgraphs? And there's been some research on this. First of all, there's a lower bound that says that roughly delta times log n size is needed. And this is actually also the diameter of the graph, in case anyone is interested. And also, it was shown that there's some upper bounds. One of them requires some constraints on delta, and also allows you need to have more colors available. Then it was shown that you can get roughly log squared n if delta is small, which is typically the regime we will be studying today. And today we'll show that actually we can get something that's tight in the dependency on n, but not the dependency on delta. And all of the upper bounds here are based on the idea of sort of gluing together several Vizing chains to form what we shall call multi-step Vizing chains. And let's see why it might be relevant to study some of these, study small augmenting subgraphs from an algorithmic point of view. So for instance, one thing is dynamic algorithms. So here you have some graph, and you're interested in maintaining some analysis, let's say an edge coloring of said graph, but edges might be inserted or deleted, and you want to then update your coloring, right? And you want to do that fast and efficiently. And so if some new edge appears, you must give it a color. And if the smallest augmenting subgraph is very large, that means you have to recolor a lot of edges, and that sort of makes the hope of doing this efficiently go away. So therefore, it's important that you can actually have small augmenting subgraphs. Another motivation is local algorithms. Here you're given some communication network represented by a graph, right? And perform computation at nodes, and you do it in rounds where you are allowed to communicate with your neighbors. Now, if you're ever gonna find a small augmenting subgraph, then you basically require that the subgraph sits in your close neighborhoods. And if the subgraph has too large a diameter, that's never gonna happen. So you're also interested in small augmenting subgraphs, because if you have the guarantee that they're also small, that means you can actually find many of them and augment in parallel, which would then give you a fast algorithm. All right. Yeah, so some of the things basically everything here is based on the idea that you can build these multi-step Vizing chains, and we show this local Vizing theorem, which was conjectured, that you can actually, it's sufficient to use colors from the list 1 up to the maximum of 1 plus the maximum degree of your endpoints. We also show that there exist augmenting subgraphs that has size at most poly delta times log n, which is tied in the dependency on n, but not in the constants or the dependency on delta. And as corollaries, we basically get a faster local algorithm. And we also get it's not faster, but we get a dynamic algorithm, which has, first of all, its worst case guarantees, but more importantly, the dependency on delta. You do not, it works for all deltas and does not require some lower bound on delta that was required before. Okay, but we will, for today, we'll focus on talking about the existence of these small augmented subgraphs. And we'll do so by considering multi-step Vizing chains. So let's take a look at what those are. So early on, we had this, we talked about if we have some Vizing chains on some uncolored edge, then we could sort of move the uncolored edge onto the bichromatic path. And now, once we've done that, we might consider the action of creating a new Vizing chain on this uncolored edge that goes somewhere else. We might also truncate that one and continue like so. And that sort of gives us a multi-step Vizing chain where each time we create a new Vizing chain, we sort of take a step. Yes. And what might happen is that at some point, we might go back and overlap with an earlier Vizing chain. We'll call that an overlapping Vizing chain. We might also have the case where we just sort of intersect in a vertex, but not in an edge. We're gonna allow that later on for some of the Vizing chains, but not all of them. But the basic idea is that there is these things. You can either allow it to overlap with some earlier edge, you cannot allow it. And for some of the constructions, we have not the ones I will be talking about today, but for some of them, we're fine with things overlapping. But for today, we will focus on things not overlapping, because that's going to allow some counting arguments to work. I mean, a natural first question you can ask is, can these things even be constructed? Yes, they can, but see in the next slide. You can also ask why they should be non-overlapping, and we're going to get back to that later. All right, so the construction is originally due to Krepik and Picurco. And the basic idea is that suppose you now want to create a new fan on this edge you've moved. Well, you can try to continue basically like we did before, but once you look at this vertex, then you know that it actually has two available colors, right? Because it's incident to some uncolored edge. So therefore, in particular, you also know that it has some color available that is not this kappa 2 that sits on the bichromatic path. So we pick this color instead. Because what we want to really avoid is that we go back and sort of overlap with the path we have already taken, right? That would not be good. And so we can continue choosing our free colors such that they are not equal to kappa 1 or kappa 2. And if we're lucky, then at some point this construction simply ends, and we can make a bichromatic path, and we can certainly make sure that we pick something, the available color at the center of the fan, to be something that is not kappa 1 and kappa 2, because it will also have two available colors, and neither of these will be kappa 2. All right. But what might happen also is, of course, that we end up at a vertex where we have to pick kappa 1 or kappa 2, but that's also fine. Then we would just pick the available colors at U to be the other one, and we would stop our construction at this very vertex, and we would know that we would, in most cases, sit in a different component in the graph induced by all edges called kappa 2 and kappa 1. And so we know that we will actually not go back and intersect and overlap with the Vizing chain that we used to get here most of the time. So that's how we can ensure that we do not overlap too much with the chain that we're sort of extending from. But we could, of course, also go back and overlap with something that happened way back in history, and we'll show how to handle that later on. All right, so let's make some initial observations. So we're just going to fix some graph G. It has maximum degree delta. We can think of delta as not being too large in this paradigm. And we let H be sort of any subgraph and see some proper partial edge coloring of G. And a basic observation is that the average length bichromatic path is short. Why is that, you might ask? Well, first of all, we know that in some subgraph H, we cannot have really too high a density. You can have density at most delta half. So we also know that one edge can belong to at most O of delta bichromatic path, right? Because if an edge is colored, there are only O of delta other choices for the colors in the bichromatic path that it sits in. So in particular, that means that since there is bichromatic path ending at every vertex in our subgraph, they cannot be too long on average, because we don't have too many edges compared to the number of vertices, and each edge cannot be too many bichromatic paths. An important other thing is also that we know that any colored edge can participate in at most O of delta squared Vizing chains, because it sits in not too many bichromatic paths, and each bichromatic path can be part of not too many Vizing chains. All right. And the second observation is that if we look at some subgraph H and we consider how many Vizing chains that can actually reach this H from G without H, then there are not too many of these. There are at most of delta to the power of 3 times the number of vertices in H by the same fact. I mean, we just look at every vertex in H, right, and it cannot be reached by too many Vizing chains, and each Vizing chain, and so basically we can just look at the first point a Vizing chain reaches this subgraph, and cannot be too many of these. And these chains are unchanged even if we start changing the coloring in H, simply because we can just consider them until the first time we reach H, and until the first time we reach H, they're sort of existing in G minus H. Okay. And so note that actually to do all of these things and to get these arguments to work, you need that the Vizing chains are non-overlapping. All right. So another important concept is that of Vizing chain reachability. So suppose we fix some uncolored edge E and we fix some length L, meaning that we are only going to consider things that we can reach through a bichromatic path that has length L, right? So if we're not gonna consider things that sit further away from the initial edge, then all of the vertices that we can reach via sort of swapping colors around this subgraph, we say belong to set R1, because typically suppress ENL. And note that this choice of Vizing chain is not necessarily unique. I mean, you make a choice at each, when you construct a fan, which color you want to consider available and stuff like that. But it doesn't really matter, because having more Vizing chains will only really help the arguments. So we're just gonna always fix one. We're always gonna pick one. But yeah, it's not a problem. And yeah, so this is a recurring thing, right? Anyways, so now we can consider the act of truncating our Vizing chains at all of the points that we can reach in R1. And we look at the Vizing chain extensions constructed as we did earlier. And some of these construction might go back and overlap with our fan and be annoying. So we won't wish to continue extending through these points. So we're going to call them bad extension points. And all of the Vizing chains might go somewhere else in the graph, and we'd be perfectly happy to extend through them. And we're going to collect all of these sort of good extension points into a set N1. Good extension points. And I mean, you can extend this idea for I-step Vizing chains. You get Ri and Ni, which are basically the vertices you can reach through non-overlapping I-step Vizing chains, or the vertices that you can safely extend through in this I level. All right. And the high-level idea is then to find a short multi-step Vizing chain with both few and short steps. So we want to only take a step length that depends on delta. So we're going to fix some step length, say L of size poly delta. And we're going to show if there's no short augmenting multi-step Vizing chain within the first I steps. That means that the set of vertices that we can reach grow exponentially. And therefore, we know that we can take at most steps. And so the size must be at most poly delta times. So again, okay, so I'm gonna be a little more technical now, so bear with me. Hopefully it won't be too bad. So basically we're gonna show this by induction, and we're gonna carry along sort of two things that we wish to show. And basically these two things are that the number of vertices that we can reach will grow very fast, exponentially, if we do not succeed in finding some short augmenting Vizing chain. And we'll also show that not only does the number of things we can reach grow very fast, it's almost equally fast grows the number of good extension points, meaning that we can then sort of get along in the new step of the induction. And so let's see why the number of vertices we can reach grows very fast. And the idea is we consider, the action of extending our Vizing chain through every good extension point on the previous level. And then we're going to collect all of the bichromatic paths from these last steps into some subgraph H. And then we know from early on and by construction really that the number of edges, we know that if we take the total length of the Vizing change, well, that's going to be at most delta squared times the number of edges, because an edge cannot participate in too many Vizing chains. And we also know that the number of vertices in the subgraph is going to be upper bounded by the sort of points where we began, plus the number of new things that we can reach. And therefore, by the first fact, we get to write this, and we get to rearrange and apply the induction hypothesis. And we get to show that Ri grows fast. And similarly, we want to show now that Ni also grows fast. So we want to say that there are not too many bad points that we can extend through. And so why could a point be bad to extend through? Well, it could be that it extends into a Vizing chain that goes back and intersects into some of the earlier levels of the things that we can reach. But we know already that there cannot be too many of these things, right? If we want to things that are bound, the things that are one hop away from all of the things that we can reach via multi-step Vizing chains of length at most arguments 2, then there are at most this many bad extension points that actually achieve this. And so we also have to make sure that we don't overlap with our own fan, but there are not too many of these either. So we can basically say that of all of the new points that we can reach, we know that not too many of them are going to be bad. So that basically says that it's big, right? And then we can also show that you can actually find many of these subgraphs in parallel. And that's important if you want to construct, for instance, a local algorithm where you have to color many uncolored edges in parallel to be able to get something fast. And the high-level idea is that basically from before, we can actually afford to artificially avoid a relatively large number of extension points if those extension points lead us to some part of the graph where we do not want to go. So that means we can start to greedily pick disjoint subgraphs, and then based on our choices, we can sort of determine which things we want to avoid. Yes. Okay, so I think finally an interesting open problem is, can there really exist local algorithms that are faster, right? So can you get something, the dependency on delta, let's say is delta is constant, so we don't care too much about the dependency on delta, but can you get something that is log-log-n dependency instead? There are sort of two barriers to this approach. First of all, we know that augmenting subgraphs, if you just do it completely naively, might have a very nice size. And second of all, at best you can color, it seems with this approach, like the best you can do is color a constant fraction of edges in parallel, right? So that's also going to give some log-n term. Thank you.